for anyone who isn't too familiar with that term, or to make sure we're all on the same page before we get started, what is Agile L&D?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. We are taking the sort of known concepts of agile, and agile is sort of a mindset, and first and foremost, and then a series of tools and techniques that ultimately started in the world of software 20 years ago. But what we're doing is we're taking those practices and we're translating them into the world of learning and development. And what I find is that therefore there's no one set framework, and generally you want to build your own toolbox of how to do that. So you sort of find out what fits for your culture, your organization, your people. But we're not reinventing the wheel, so we're taking that and applying it to our own practices. And really, I call it a kind of, it's like agile project management and design thinking for L&D. And the main thing is we're translating it into our context, using the right words, using the right kind of expressions so we feel comfortable with it. At the heart of agile is delivering value through to your customer in an incremental, iterative way. So it's the idea is we need to know what is value, what does our customer, just generally our people, find valuable? How do you get the evidence that they find that valuable? And then how do you use that as evidence of how to build the next stage in your solution? So we're incrementally delivering value through to our customer, slice by slice. The other key point around that is to get that done and to respond and adapt to our customer, we want all the skills that's needed in the team to get the job done, because that means you can, respond and adapt quickly to your customer needs. And that means multi-skilled, multidisciplinary teams, which is, I think, is a really interesting premise for L&D and HR. And then I think the other key thing is that sort of sitting behind all of this is that agile is ultimately about solving complex problems. And so agility is sort of a key term used in business more and more, and it can mean different things to different organizations. But the argument is that we now live and work in a more complex marketplace, complex world. We face problems that we haven't experienced before, but also there's no clear cause and effect. So, and there's multiple ways you can solve problems. Like multiple ways you can solve the issue of well-being in an organization. What does that even mean? And so we need, you can't just run projects in the same way. We need new tools to help us test, learn, experiment, get data, so we can start to move forward with more certainty around any solution that we design.
Yeah. No, I agree with all of that. And actually, I hadn't thought about that idea that there's no clear cause and effects when new problems come around. So that's why you need to operate so quickly or testing so quickly, because you just don't have the evidence, or the assumptions aren't even there when something is a completely new problem. So that makes
Yes.
complete sense to me now.
Yeah. There's a term that I use a bit now, which is the extension on from VUCA. And it's called fundamental uncertainty. So there's an argument that with VUCA, while it was volatile and uncertain and ambiguous, there was a sense that if you just waited a little bit longer or you worked a bit longer, you would find out the information that you needed. And what we're now saying is no, change is going to happen, and with the pace of change, probably quite soon. So any solution or plan you create, there's something that's going to change. You just don't know what that is yet. So you need to, make decisions based on not knowing everything, but also being able to respond and adapt in that plan as those changes come about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that helped me visualize this most in the book is there's an image of the Agile Manifesto translated, and it's
Mm-hmm.
four things, something over something. So to focus on people over processes, people experiences over employee policy, creating value together over perfectionism, and adaptability over prescriptiveness. And the reason I like this is it's not like an either or framing or one or the other. It's just about shifting the weight to the thing that allows you to be more agile, I guess. So in this case, if we focus on people more than process, we don't create process for process sake that we're unsure will work and delays us, but we actually create process that helps the person do the job. And therefore, inherently, we become more agile. So maybe I can include it in the email I'll send out afterwards, that picture. But yeah, I
Yeah.
really like it.
I was trying to take the picture that you had and put it into chat, but Maybe you can do that. My I'm not as digitally savvy as I'd like to be
Me
right at this
neither.
moment in time.
But yeah, it's really interesting that idea, it's just a shift away from maybe the things you relied on that are inherently
Mm.
not agile and a bit cumbersome to things that lend themselves to being a bit more not reactive but proactive at speed, maybe is the other side of the coin, I guess.
Yeah, and also what do you need to sort of get right first? So I think the people over process one is really interesting. And I talked about the 25 box matrix in this organization I was working in, tipping me over the edge. And it was because, there was 5 levels of performance. So then the organizations then, well, why don't we do 5 levels of talent and have 25 boxes, and most people would be familiar with the 9 box, which, was already too many boxes. And then this whole process started to develop about what box, getting people to use all the boxes of the 25 matrix. And we had lost the purpose of why we started these conversations, which were, how do you find great people? How do you know you've got what skills you've got in the organization? How do you help people move into new roles? How do you fill gaps? And so we've always got to take it back to why we're doing this. What's the problem to solve? How do we make sure that it's working for people, that the employee experience is successful, it's delivering value? Then we can design the policy and the processes to support that and enable that. And I think it's flipping it. And I think that's really healthy for L&D and HR people to always, challenge themselves over. Yeah.
Yeah. That speaks nicely to the fourth chapter of the book because that is all about how you deliver value early and often using the agile approach. And it feels like that really overlaps with a constant pain point I'm hearing is, whether you call it engagement, buy-in, getting people to care. Yeah, it really feels like that is just such a common principle. But this chapter four felt a bit like the antidote, some of the principles that you explained in there. So yeah, tell us a little bit about how we can deliver value early and often by being agile.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of core premises and or concepts, and one is, I talk about these five design principles, and the first one is product led, and this is because I actually now view as more and more as product managers, and because we design products to deliver value, and that product sits within an overriding employee experience product. There's multiple components, but ultimately, how do you know what you're designing is getting the result that you need? And to do that, first of all, we need that better diagnostic of what is the problem that we're trying to solve. There's often multiple problems in a big complex business challenge. So unpacking that, making it into much more achievable, manageable chunks, and ruthlessly prioritizing, because again, you can't do everything, and you definitely can't do it all at the start or at the same time. So first of all, what is the problem you're solving? What's the most important, problem or sub-problem to start with? And then how do you deliver something of value to start progressing, to get a result? And that's, evidence that you're starting to solve that problem. So it might be a proof of concept. It might be, you might sketch up ideas of how the program might look, and you take that to a series of people. They pretty quickly tell you what they don't like and what they do and whether that's going to work for them. And then you can start to go from there. I've just this morning, I was on a call with a organization, and they wanted to build a more skills-based approach to learning. And what happened in the background is this huge kind of collection of learning and skills got put into spreadsheets and SharePoint pages, and it's just overwhelming in terms of the content. And employees just don't know where to go and how to kind of, steer through all these choices. Essentially, they're overwhelmed with content. And what was interesting is we went back and said, okay, well, what are we trying to achieve with this? And we brought in what the organization needs to achieve with their customers, what people are trying to do on a day-to-day basis. Oh, I need to speak to this customer. I need to, present this idea. I need to be able to get them to agree to this thing. Okay, all right. So now if we start to target those problems to solve with the skills and the learning, and we get people to answer a few questions and we send them to that learning, first of all, it's in a context that they're like, oh, okay, I need to use this in the flow of work and this is how to do it. All right, I need to learn this. Okay, now I'm going to go off and apply it. So it's a good example of how you can do it in stages, and start to build up over time a solution that's delivering value ultimately early and often. And so that testing, that using the data, at each stage, what's the evidence that you can move forward into the next stage of the solution, or has it not worked? And so we fail fast and cheaply, and then we move off into a new direction. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like the two different angles you described there, because in one scenario, they're trying to solve a really big problem that they've actually not drilled down into, and therefore they make things worse. And then in the other side of that, you're saying that if we just break it down to sub problems that make up the bigger problem, then we can test what solves a small problem, and time to value is shorter. So yeah, I really love that. And from
Yeah.
personal experience, that always works better, because you don't have to keep telling people that, oh, it's coming, or, like, oh, we're working on it. It's, look, here's how this thing could solve this issue. And that's kind of what you describe as just developing MVP, or minimum viable product, in the short cycles,
Exactly.
isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think, there's some core concepts, minimal valuable or minimal viable product, get something up and working. It's functional. It needs to be, people need to like it and want to engage with it, but it doesn't have all the bells and whistles just yet, because you're trying to prove that this is actually going to fix the problem and people are going to use it. They're going to find it valuable. Once you've got that evidence, we can start to delight people, add on extra bits. For example, this skills-based approach that I'm working on with an organization, we're going to start with how do we curate them towards the learning and get them, enrolled and doing the learning. The next step is going to be how do they demonstrate that learning, and then go back to showing that progression and updating their kind of overall capabilities. So doing it in stages, knowing that as you said, you've got a prioritized list of problems. How do we solve the first one, second one, third one, and then start to deliver value early and often. Yeah.
Is the example you're mentioning there, is it that you kind of followed that, like, this has to happen first? As you broke down the problem with that organization you're working with, it's like, well, it's like a yes/no chart. If they don't engage in learning, or don't find it anywhere, then nothing else happens after that. So we have to do that before we can even worry about that. Is that kind of the approach?
Totally. Yeah. I think an example I use in the book is around a career development problem. And interestingly, it's sort of based on a real problem where initially senior leaders were like, oh, we need to solve career development. You need to design a career development framework, and the team went, hang on, let's just find out what's going on here. And when they delved into, and this is where I think design thinking is such an essential component of Agile, particularly for L&D. I think we'll talk about that. They went and spent time with people, looked at extreme users, and did some empathy interviews. And what they found is that, yeah, there's lots of different versions of career development going on. But one thing, so they had these series of problems to solve. And the first one was, well, how do we just make career opportunities more visible in the organization? Because what they found is that there were opportunities. It was a pretty big organization. People just didn't know how to navigate and find a new job or a new project or a new opportunity in the organization. And it was easier to leave and go and do that and find the new job somewhere else. So, but underneath it were other things like, how do we get managers to support people's career development? How do we, how do we help people be coaches and mentors? So there was all these other sub problems to do, but they realized, no, let's go here first. And that developed, and it became this idea around designing this sort of marketplace, job opportunity website internally, which all sounded fantastic. But how do you know that people would even use it? And that's what they needed to test first. So they mocked it up on cardboard and got people to, react to example web pages in front of them. And only by having the evidence that people would want to even log on and use this system did they then progress the idea. And that's what I mean. You need the evidence that that people are going to use it and engage with it before you move forward to the next stage. Yeah.
Mm. Interesting. So I think that leads us nicely into basically there's five principles in the Agile L&D playbook in the book. Obviously, we won't have time to go through all of them, so we're going to try and tackle three. But the first one that leads us to is being product led. And actually,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of what you're saying there makes sense to that because the goal isn't to build product requirements like the marketplace. If you've gone full head first into that, that's like building a product, isn't it? But what we're trying
Mm-hmm.
to do is solve problems. And a problem actually is either visibility or enablement in that case. So why is viewing people experience as a product a better way for us to define, measure, and deliver that value as an L&D team?
Yeah, so I've been spending time with different teams working on this approach, and it's really interesting. People are finding it a way, it helps them understand both how you better articulate value and then start to measure value. And so I'll sort of take it back to the core concept. And this is not mine, this is out there in the world of product management. So again, we're just kind of taking business concepts that are already live and happening and take them into our world. But in a commercial environment, products deliver value by solving problems for or a shared problem for a group of people. So I always, take my phone. Okay, so I buy my phone because I want to, well, probably surf Instagram and lose lots of hours, but I also need to stay connected. I need to access my work email. I need to know where people in my family are. I need to, I'm Australian living overseas, so I like to stay connected to friends and family back in Australia. So I solve problems with these products. And commercially, a commercial organization that generates value in the return of, sales, profit, loyalty. I love this brand and I want to then buy more products from that same brand. I recommend it to people. Maybe it's a subscription. So then I keep my subscription going. Um, and so what we're doing is we're taking that concept of product experience. How do you design your whole organization around delivering that product experience through to your end customer? And we're taking that into the employee experience. So if we start to see the employee experience as our product, yes, made up of component parts, so onboarding, recruitment, career development, reward, progression, promotion, and even leaving. But ultimately, the whole thing is our product. And the way that we know it's delivering value is it solves problems. So, a common problem people have is how do I develop my career? How do I make an impact in my job? How do I get my job done easily? How do I feel, healthy and healthy at work and my well-being's okay? So, these are all problems that we can identify. And ultimately, the more that our employee experience is solving these through the organization, the better we can articulate the value we deliver, and the better we can measure it. And if we can relate that down to each business challenge that we face. And it also helps us start to prioritize because again, there's so much we can do in an organization, but how do we know what's the biggest challenge to solve first? And we do that by understanding value and impact. Yeah.
Yeah. And that kind of overlaps with another problem we often hear is showing impact or ROI or however people want to frame it. But yeah, I think just being clear on the problems your product solves is the clearest way to do that.
Exactly. And just
Cool.
on that, there's, I talk a lot in the book around, you know, I call it lead and lag indicators. So if we even go back to that example earlier around we need to make career opportunities more visible in the organization. And our core solution to begin with is this marketplace website. Okay, and we might do it in stages of kind of design and release. But to begin with, I'm looking at lead indicators. So this is how many people are accessing it. What are they doing with it? Are they applying for jobs? Are they getting jobs? Is there but then so that kind of user behavior, particularly good when we've got digital solutions, but more and more L&D has a digital component for us
Mm.
to track. But even people opening emails and attending sessions. But that's activity and that's our lead indicators. So they're telling you people are engaging with this in a way that's going to lead to the outcomes that we're ultimately wanting to see. And that's then your lag indicators. And this is the bigger value metrics that we're trying to influence. So this is, retention, job movements, engagement at certain stages of the career, net promoter score, productivity, more sales. And we want to be able to measure that and show that. And I think by better understanding the flow and how your problem is solving the problem is leading towards those outcomes, you can start to put measures throughout the whole solution and over a time period. Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of it maybe is that I guess to be agile or to continue to work in those short sprints, you can't lose confidence in the approach. And if you only focus on the lagging indicator, I think that might happen 6 months down the line, then you
Yes.
potentially will
Yes.
lose momentum. Because that's why I really like that example, because if it is the visibility problem, then you can just say, well, are more people now opening emails about internal vacancies, or do we have an internal jobs board and the traffic to that has gone up by 10%? And we know that we're starting to move in the right direction. But if we simply judged it on how many people have moved into a new role internally, then we kind of ruin the momentum that we want to build, or the sort of a function of
Totally.
agile. Yeah.
Totally. It's still for too much down the line. And
Yeah.
also, we also, then have the big debates of, oh, but, there's so many other factors that influence this. How do we really measure that? So it's about, having that whole kind of, I suppose, roadmap of how you're designing the solution and how you're measuring different stages of the solution to know that you're moving towards those longer term outcomes. Yeah.
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 Absolutely. And there's lots and lots of advice and practical exercises in the book for people to kind of become more product led in their mindset and approach. But is there one sort of high leverage or universal thing you'd recommend people could do today to start making that shift, perhaps?
Uh, yeah. Well, can I give two things?
Yeah,
Two
absolutely.
things is the first is I've just been I've been doing a lot of offsites and sessions with teams over the last few weeks, and what's been a big theme is getting better at diagnosing the business challenge. So not jumping to that solution. We all think of it, but spending time thinking about the challenge, breaking it down, thinking about the impact on the organization, thinking about the value. So I've done a lot of sessions where we look at business challenges from anything from, needing to develop leaders through to, future ready skills, through to building more collaborative network teams. And again, all of those topics are really big, but spending time of, why would we focus on this? Why would we solve it? What would be the value to the business bottom line, the end customer, and the employee? And being able to do some storytelling around that and engage your stakeholders around that diagnostic. Because once you've done that, you will have, I think, much better partnership in then moving towards a solution. And they're going to be much more willing to work with you to go and test solutions, get evidence, and keep kind of moving towards solving that hypothesis that you've got. So I think that's one, is spending time there, not jumping to solution mode too quickly. And then the other one is I've put together in the book something that I've given it a grand title, but it's not that grand, but it's called the People Experience Product Development Life Cycle. And it's stages of a project. And I've put it in the words that feel right for L&D people. And it's just getting us to be much more mindful of what stage of solution designing and implementation we're at, what you would need to do at each stage, who you're contracting with, what you're measuring, how do you, and then how do you transition to the next one? And I'm finding that is being really useful for people to kind of think back. And even if you don't use agile methods at every stage, it really helps you design solutions in that more iterative way and more evidence-based way. And one of the big ones that I emphasize is that if you make stuff, where does it go? who's going to look after it? Is it, will you have to look after it? Are you going to now have to run this every quarter, every month? Or does it involve the business doing something? And so that contracting up front about how you maintain products, where does it go? How does it, what's the capacity that you and your team have to now maintain this? Does it replace something else? And so thinking again about that portfolio of products that you have that you're delivering out across the organization. Yeah.
Awesome. I want to move on to another principle from the book, which is being more human-centric in your design, which you actually referenced earlier. I realized I like this point so much, I made what can only be described as a small essay of notes before we did this conversation. But I guess that the thing that really resonated with me is that often we start with the goal, like we need to reach X people or this target. And then we start creating and designing to hit the target rather than solving the problem for the person. And then that kind of puts this pressure on us to have the perfect solution because it has to be
Mm.
perfect to hit the target. But if we focus on the problem for a person or a business, we could be more agile and we could bake in the sort of human element to it. So that's kind of what resonated with me from
Mm.
the book. But I'm curious to hear, how can we be more human centric to help us get closer to our goals, really?
Yeah, no, I think I really like that take on it. And well, so human-centric design is sort of the philosophy that sits over anything that sort of sits in that design thinking space. And so your design thinking are essentially your tools, your toolkit, and then human-centered design is that ethos and approach that you take. And the main argument or the main tenet is that by stepping into the experience of humans, of the users of what's going on, we can better define the problem and also then build a solution that's going to be that's applicable to them, that is more user friendly, that is going to actually be, as we said, valuable to them and actually fix that problem at that level of real people. And it sounds obvious, but actually, so many times when we set off to design something, we move immediately into our area of expertise. We move immediately into our assumptions. We've seen it before. Okay, now let's design this management development program and get it out. So it's about spending time in that lived experience. And by doing that, we're essentially better equipped at designing a solution that's actually going to work, to land well, and that will give us the outcome that we need. And I think the other thing, however, is that the reason I emphasize that is I think L&D people naturally lend themselves towards that. But then we can, I think, get a bit stuck in our frameworks or again, our content. So it's about constantly challenging ourselves. Are we making this, you know, are we making this for the people that we're solving it for? And do we have the evidence that they're going to use it in the way that we think they should or will help them? Yes, no. And so that constant testing at that human level, I think, is just so valuable to then produce much more valuable outcomes. And ultimately, we design products that either need to change behavior and or change the performance of an organization. And so you need evidence along the way that your products are doing that. Yeah.
Mhm. I just had a big realization that I do this idea of getting it out there rather than being human centric. And I think part of it is it's easy to conflate working agile versus working at speed. So
Mm.
because I have some validation that a type of content works, for example, then I will take whatever I need to distribute and put it into that template or that framework because I have some validation that it works in some capacity. But actually, I'm not taking a step back to think, is this the best way to display this information for the person in order to solve the problem? So I'm sure maybe other people have fell into that trap as well, actually, where they think speed of
Totally.
output is the same as being agile, but actually it's not, is it? It's about being more contextual around how you design and taking a step back.
Totally. And it's, go slow at some stages to then go fast. You know, uh, I'll go back to the project I'm working on because I've been on the call for 2 hours this morning on it. But we're needing to spend a lot more time now analyzing the skills, the kind of the curation of the learning. How do we steer people in that direction? And we're just looking at one skill set at the moment. But once we've landed the fundamental design. We've tested it. We know that the words resonate with people. People are going to click on buttons, on the interface that we create. We can then move quite quickly and scale up and bring in more skills, bring in more learning, and actually, sort of now then scale that across the business. So I think there is, knowing when to go a bit slower, to really validate, because if you've got that validation, everything that you design from that point onwards is going to be right, and it's going to be moving in the right direction. Yeah.
Nice. Similar to the last point, there's lots of good frameworks and advice for people to kind of bring human-centered design into what they do. But are there any, again, big impact or high leverage things that you recommend people start doing from today to factor it more into what they create?
Yeah, I just say that always use my rule of thumb is always have three sources at that research stage. So it's some people data. Just use what you've already got. Don't need to go and get worried about data that you don't have. Something like personas, or something to bring your employee to life. And then you can either then go and look at some external research, or do something like an experience map, a journey map, and just generally pulling on three sources. And because often we need to time box this stage as well. So what does happen is people get really into the research step and the human, what's the lived experience, and we kind of then lose ourselves in that. So it's about being realistic. Time box it. What's right for this project? Go and get three sources. Pull out your list of insights, and then get going. Yeah. Because ultimately, I think in the book I show that, and anyone that's familiar with design thinking and human-centered design, we all know that it's about these two double diamonds, divergent, convergent thinking. But the main thing is the list of insights that then become your list of problems to solve, and then that's your first point of prioritization. Yeah,
Yeah, I like that. I guess having different sources stops you from leaning on any bias, or it creates a more high context
definitely.
picture of who you're serving
Yeah,
as an audience. So, yeah, I
exactly.
love that advice. Cool. We're going to go through one more of the principles, and then we'll get to some questions. So if anyone does have any
Alrighty.
questions, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to them very shortly. Like I said, there's five in total, but the last one I want to ask you about is experimentation. And because, as you describe in the book, the concept of failing fast to learn quickly underpins agile experimentation. But you flag this problem that sometimes we're either scared of failure, or when we are experimenting, we're not doing it to learn. We're doing it to prove that the hypothesis is right, rather than, and it's easy to fall into that trap because you're either enthusiastic about a hypothesis or skeptical. So you go in with this mindset. But the better thing is to observe and learn from the results, because ultimately you make this great point that often the data that you don't expect, or the people who choose not to participate in the program, are the people you learn the most from. So
Mm.
what is kind of that advice to zoom out a bit and experiment more effectively to learn, rather than to prove your own assumptions wrong
Yeah.
or right, I guess.
Look, it's really hard, and I think uh, well, first of all, it's a bit of a discipline, isn't it, to just kind of challenge ourselves, challenge our thinking. I think this is where working in a multi-skilled team really comes into play, and then being mindful of the people that you test that hypothesis with, and that diversity that you're testing it with. But it's about, even if you've got a result which 80% of people are doing one thing and 20% the other, we generally go, okay, great, we've got the 80-20, off we go. But it's lean, okay, let's just go and see what's going on for this 20, and just and see if there is learning there, or see because if that 20 is a certain group of employees, or a certain group of people, if that group is uh, a certain and then if there's bias in that, then that's a huge thing that we need to know about. So I think it's being data hungry, I think, is the term. And then with the hypothesis is that you go and look at the outcome. It's not about one or the other. It's like, okay, what's the result? What's the data? Now let's make some decisions. And And I find that if you're very transparent with that process, so again, I'm talking about this project I'm on at the moment. This morning, we actually demonstrate some prototypes to each other. And we did the structure of we started with our hypothesis, and then here's some working assumptions that we have at the moment about our design. And then it's exploring that hypothesis. So I think the more you're transparent about this working, and again, you don't have to use the word agile, but you just say, okay, we're doing this thing based on this assumption, and these are hypotheses. What do what's the data, and what does that look like? And the more you are open and you talk about it with others, I think you just build muscle around it. Yeah.
I like that you made the point about who makes up that 80 or 20, because someone made a great point to
Mm.
me before around mapping stakeholders with the idea that the people who might be really up for giving you their time on a project might actually be really irrelevant to the project. And the people who
Yes,
really don't want to
totally.
give you any time are probably the people you need to speak to most. So, what if the 20% most affected by the problem are the 20% who didn't engage with it, and the 80% who are
Yes.
very loosely linked to the problem are the ones who gave you all the great feedback? Like, um, it's like you made the point earlier, you're checking yourself at every stage, because if you just took that on face value, 80 and 20, you'd plow all your effort into the solution that works for the wrong audience, and therefore
Yes.
you're not agile. You got to start
Yeah.
again, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is where it's also flipping or using for some framing as to why do you run an experiment. An experiment is managing risk. So I need to manage the risk that I don't invest too much time, energy, and therefore ego in any solution, so that I don't get to the stage where it's harder to say this is not the right thing to do. And I think that's what happens in workplaces, is that if we do put so much effort and time and money into a project and we get so far with it, and then it starts to become clear that where it's failing, it's not delivering the value, it becomes harder and harder to disengage. And so I think if we frame it as, I need to manage that risk, and I need to know that once I get to the stage of, signing tender forms, committing to certain budgets, I've got good data to show that this is the right thing to do. And so again, I think if we use, put it more into, I need to use this as project management or product development tools. I need to do this as a kind of a scientist of my profession, rather than I'm going to be vulnerable and it feels uncomfortable getting feedback in an experiment. No, it's about, okay, I need to manage risk and make sure I invest in the right way. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Daniel makes a great point in the chat. It's the sunk cost fallacy, but of emotion
totally.
of investment, basically, isn't
Yes.
it? Because if it takes you 6 months to plan something, there's no chance you're going to row back from that, is it? Like, let's be real.
No,
We're
no,
all self-aware enough to know that we're just too far down the rabbit hole at that point. So,
totally.
yeah,
And we've all been at organizations where some pretty big projects keep going
yeah,
because there's
yeah,
some pretty big
yeah.
egos involved by that stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's when you need to get out the why are we doing this again counter and mark on the
Yeah,
tally how many
exactly. I
times
know.
people ask you why are we doing this again.
Yeah.
I guess there's
We've
a
got some
framework.
good
Yeah.
examples in our society as well.
100%. There's millions, isn't there? There's a good 6-part sort of framework for experimentation in the book that if people want to go check it out, they can. But I guess the main thing that underpins this is the measurement stage of that, which just says what data needs to be collected and assessed in the experiment to determine the result. I think if that's your
Hmm.
starting point, then you kind of strip away ego, or you strip away trying to prove your own hypothesis, right? Because data is such a good sort of like starting point to work backwards from, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I just quickly copied it and put it
Yeah,
in there,
perfect.
but yeah, and as I said, I use this all the time, and even today, I was using this with the team, and they were very new. They're not an agile team. They're very new to a lot of these techniques, but it worked. It got them to think about, all right, what am I testing? What sits behind this design? What's going to be my measures of success? And so it's actually quite a simple process to follow. Yeah.
Cool. Right. I think we've managed time very effectively, which is excellent considering we're talking about time box activities and we've ticked our own
Which
box
is
there.
very rare for me
Yeah.
when I'm
Oh, I'm the
talking about
same. I
this
love it. Too
topic.
many tangents. That's my problem. But we have made it successfully to giving ourselves about 15 minutes for the Q&A. So if anyone, there's already one in the chat and someone sent me a question ahead of time that we'll get to now. But yeah, anyone else got any questions, feel free to drop them in now. The one I got ahead of time, Natal, was about from someone who's reading the book at the moment. And it was about if you have any advice for implementing agile ways of working when you're only a team of one. So the
Mm,
context here is that they're working alone or with one or two stakeholders and SMEs who are lending their time but are already very busy. So trying to
mm.
implement some of the things like the Scrum or carrying out the kind of regular processes might be difficult. So they framed it as maybe it's working in the spirit of Agile, but without some of the process occasionally. But how do you view that? If you're a team of one and you want to be more agile, and we know what the pressure's like for a team of one, what would the advice be there?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question and a common scenario, particularly for L&D. So so there's a couple of things. One is you run your own portfolio of work, and sort of there's two levels of that. One is essentially what I call the big chunks of work. Sometimes in Agile they're called epics, but ultimately project versus project. Okay, we're solving this thing around management development. We're solving this thing around career development in this part of the business. And so have your portfolio and be quite ruthless with using some criteria to prioritize, uh, what challenges to work on at any one time. And you could bring in some stakeholders to help you do that prioritization. And that's what you're linking to an overriding roadmap and sort of time frame and milestones. That board doesn't move too much because, if you're working on something like leadership development, it's probably going to take you 6 months, for example. Then sitting underneath that is more the kind of backlogs for those particular projects or things that you're delivering out. I think the big thing for you will be thinking about your capacity. So what have you already committed to in terms of what do you already roll out in the organization for L&D? So and this is like what I call the delivering the employee experience. So what have you already said that what have you already designed and you need to keep going? And then what's your discretionary effort that remains? And then that's where you spend time focusing on different problems to solve. And then based on the prioritization, you look at how do you bring some people in to help you at different stages. And I would also just think about that stages of the project, because you could use different people at the start to do some research versus different people to help you design it or implement it versus different people that are kind of testing. So it's maybe being a bit more creative with who you bring in at different stages. Because yes, people are busy, they don't always have the time, and they're needing to give their discretionary effort to you.
Yeah.
So that's always hard. But
Yeah.
the other probably big message is don't use L&D terms, use business terms. So if you start talking about the business problem that you're solving, and how do we get the result, usually you get more involvement for people because they're like, yeah, oh God, I've got to solve this. I've got to be part of this. And they'll really want to be lean in and give you some time. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. That's a great answer. Kimberly mentioned that's really helpful for her as a team of one.
Cool.
And hopefully, Dania, that answers your question as well, actually, about getting the buy-in when you don't have the sort of team or the top level support, because like to Natal's point of using other people at different stages and so on. Um, there is another question as well. It's about how to be agile successfully on multiple product line projects. So, for example, if
Mm.
there's multiple challenges, um, like skill required, lack of motivation, finding solution within specified deadlines. I mean, it might go back to what you said earlier about just doing these in increments or prioritizing, but I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, look, I think this is a huge issue for L&D teams in general, and then any L&D teams that then sit within a people function, it gets even more complicated. We all take on way too much, and we're trying to do way too many things at one time, and we're task switching every day, every week. And it's really hard to manage that. but we do need, like, the more that you can become more focused and clear in those priorities, and this is where that value early and often is really important. So if you've got multiple projects, ideally you're wanting to try and start delivering value in one, so you can then move on to the next one and the next one. And so think incremental, think MVP, but also don't stretch yourself. So what we often then do is, okay, we've got 5 projects all at the same time. And that means you're moving across multiple things, challenges to solve. Where possible, try and streamline and time box. So maybe it's you try and either, I don't know, do kind of like a intense sprint for one project to accelerate it and get it to the point where it can then be, managed in a different way or rolled out in a different way. Could you just can you say, not yet to 3 projects and then go, focus on 2 and again, get it to a certain point and then go, yep, we've delivered enough value. Let's move on to the other ones.
Yeah.
Other techniques I sometimes use with teams are things like, Thursday is the day that you always work on the management development project and nothing else happens on that day. Everyone, all stakeholders and other team members know that. And on that day, you get work done on the project as well as having meetings and kind of, coming together as a team. Because what happens is we go and put all the meetings in our diary for the project, but we then never also just carve out the time of getting work done. So it's really being mindful of how do you create that hyper focus for teams? Because Agile is about teams working together. You can't just be busy individuals owning different components. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed about a lot of these kind of changes to approach in L&D is that they're not going to happen overnight, and you kind of need to maybe like stagger the approach. So maybe it's you kind of solve one project in an agile way to the point that you made around maybe build enough credibility to then use it to do the rest. And like I've fallen foul of
Mm.
this before, trying to solve every problem the same way overnight to drive this
Totally.
culture change. But it's often just about managing it a bit, I guess, from personal experience.
Yeah. And also being really, some things you just get done. Some things you need to test and do more research on. Some things is just a quick kind of improvement maintenance. So I think it's also when you have that list of, again, it goes back to seeing what you're delivering across the organization as a portfolio that makes up the overriding product. And in that portfolio, what's working well, and we just need to keep going. What needs to change and iterate, and experiment with. What's the big new thing to focus on, and being really clear about where we're using our capacity across those areas. And start to really think about, all right, well, if I've got so much capacity this week already wrapped up in, the management development program that we've already created and we're rolling out, I really don't have much discretionary effort for these other things, and being really realistic about that. Yeah. Yeah.
100%. Um, Great question from Jenna, but she also mentions that she loves that you called it the minimum lovable product rather than the MVP in the book, which is great actually because
Yes.
it syncs up with what we discussed earlier about people buy experiences, not products. So if it's not something they love, then it's not an experience they're going to buy into, is it? So
Exactly. Because I think a lot of people think, oh no, MVP is that it's
done.
half done, it's half baked,
Yeah,
or it's
yeah,
a bit ugly. No, people still need to actually want to use it. Yeah,
yeah.
otherwise you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah. If I think about the amount of times I've heard someone describe that they love something or that they thought it was viable, I know which one I've heard more often. So I
Exactly.
like the reframing for that reason as well. The question from Jenna was, what new skills and mindsets do you believe are essential for L&D professionals to thrive in an agile L&D environment?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because of I've been doing, as I said, working with various teams over the last few weeks, and we've been looking at trends and new skills and how do you apply them. I think there's a couple of things that are coming out. One is we need to be more digitally savvy. So, and, AI is a really good example. It's so we need to lean in, understand how is AI being used in the products that we're creating or the products that we're buying to support our learning. But we need to do it in a way where we do some critical thinking around it. So what I'm seeing as the skill is data and synthesizing data, understanding how an algorithm is making a decision with data, and then how do you use data that comes from a system to value add. And a really good way that I've had sort of how to treat AI explained is we need to use it in an area where we're an expert, because then we can critically analyze the information that's coming out, because everyone's worried about misinformation, hallucinations, all these things with AI. So you need to see it as an intern that helps you get work done, that speeds up the kind of the productivity. So they're like a co-worker, co-intelligence. But you need to be the expert of what the AI is working on, because you need to be able to make decisions around it. And I think that's a really interesting space to operate, because we move from being the sort of creator to the editor. And if I think about some learning products that are out there, and I'm sure, Gary, you can help us know how yours is developing this area. But one example was AI being like the kind of the coach, So we've got this coach bot that's going, "Hey, you just learnt this. What are you doing now with the skill?" And but then it's also saying, "Oh, okay, is there any situations where you've struggled to apply that skill?" And so the coaching's interesting, but what's really interesting is that AI coach is then producing a report in the background that goes to the L&D team for them to go, "Okay, we've got these people where they've just learnt about this skill. Here's the challenges that they're facing attempting to apply it, or here's where they fell down, or here's the gap." And that's giving the L&D team great insight into what do they now need to do next, what do they develop next. So how do we get smart with how we're using digital and data to really value add, I think for me is a key theme. The other one is diagnosing business challenges and problems, understanding how to talk about impact, understanding how to talk about numbers, being commercially aware, commercially viable as business partners in our role. Yeah.
That's awesome. Brilliant. So we've got no more questions on Talisman, which means we've
Ah.
done a smashing job.